Hey, everybody. It's just so wonderful to be with you. I've done quite a few of these Zoom gatherings for Omega with so many of you. And every time I sign on and see the faces, I just almost feel like crying because it's just so good to feel part of a community and to connect, especially with Omega's campus being closed for our 2020 season, and it would be the height of it right now. Being with all of you this way is almost just as good. So thank you for joining us today. We have a wonderful thing planned. And I see that there are people calling in from all over the world. I noticed as we were all signing in, there were people from New Mexico and Alaska and Chile and Europe and Nebraska and Canada, Chicago, everywhere. There's hundreds of us on today on Zoom, and there are also people joining us on Facebook Live. And I say welcome to everyone. I did something this past weekend that was kind of exciting in these COVID times. I got in my car and I drove away from my town, and I even crossed state lines. I felt like an outlaw. And I went to visit my sister. And throughout the weekend, we were sort of COVID careful. And then by the end, we had just become one happy family. And when I went to say goodbye to my nephew, who's one of my favorite people in the world, without thinking, I leaned in and I hugged him. And it's a very bad thing. I hugged him. And he's a big guy, and he just wrapped his arms around me. And I just had this overwhelming sense of happiness and joy. And I hadn't realized how much I had missed real connecting with people. And I had this visceral experience during that hug of like, humans are made for connection. Humans are made for community. I mean, there's been all these studies done about how in our hyper stressful, hyper consumer driven culture, what do people miss the most? And they say two things, the top two things: time and connecting with people in community, a sense of belonging. So I thought to myself, who could I invite on today to talk to us about creating community, whose whole work, his whole life, first as a musician and now as a philanthropist and a musician, his whole life has been about nurturing the seeds of community, helping people come together in community. I've seen him do this amazingly in concerts. The first time I ever met him, I didn't even meet him, I just saw one of his amazing kind of rock opera, native indigenous music thing. It was years ago. That was before I even met him. And then since then, he has performed at Omega and taught at Omega many times. So his name is Peter Buffett, and he's here with us. And he actually is part of my local community. He lives here in the Hudson Valley. And so he's going to talk with us today about this human need for connected communities and how we might use these really profound times to come together as opposed to splinter apart further. So he had this idea. Usually when we do these Zoom conversations, people wait until the very end to do like 15 minutes of Q&A. But in his true connected community self, he said, no, let's have people write in the chat if you're on Zoom, or in the line where you write comments in Facebook Live. Write your questions right now, right in the beginning, all the way through, and I'll ask Peter some questions, and you can, and we'll try to use that as a way to connect. So Peter Buffett is an Emmy award-winning composer and performer. He's also an author of a best-selling book called Life is What You Make It. And his music has been featured in Dances with Wolves and other films and television shows. But he also has this whole other life. And he explains it. He and his wife, Jennifer, explain they had one life, then there was a big bang, and then there was another life. So, Peter, as a way of introducing yourself to us, tell us about your life before Big Bang, and then what was the Big Bang, and what is it like now? So welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much. Great to be here. And it is incredible to see the geography alone in terms of where all these faces come from. So thank you for having me. Thank you all for coming. It's incredible. So I heard Nebraska in there somewhere, and that's, of course, where my story started, is in Omaha, Nebraska. And a very relatively typical upbringing. I went to public school. I didn't know what my dad did, but I knew he did it all the time. That's about all we knew. And went along my merry way, went off to college, dropped out, really realized that music was my North Star, what was really guiding me. And pursued that and was fortunate enough to have a successful career writing music, mostly, like you said, for film and television, commercials, that sort of thing. And I lived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I met my wife, Jennifer, for many years. I lived in San Francisco, going along until 2006, and that's what I call the Big Bang, when my dad, Warren Buffett, decided to give all his money away. And what he meant by that was giving it to various philanthropic foundations, philanthropic organizations. So suddenly Jennifer and I became stewards of a very large foundation, completely unexpected in our life when that happened in 2006. And that changed it, it fundamentally changed it. And I would say it changed it mostly in the sense that we got to see things that most people don't get to see, or don't have the option really, or the opportunity in some ways, because you never think of necessarily going to a place like Liberia or Sierra Leone or Bangladesh or rural India. And we did those things to learn. We knew that once we got this big gift, we had a lot of learning to do, and we continue to learn. It never stops. And what that allowed me to see after spending over a decade working with Indigenous people in my musical career, and understanding the true history of our country and colonialism and all the things that followed, then I got to go to other countries and see how that spread. Really, well, in these times specifically, the analogy seems correct, but like a virus. The colonizing consciousness, as you might call it, has spread throughout the world. And we were able to, because of the foundation, really kind of peek under the covers of a global system that, again, most of us don't see. We don't know, most of us, where our shirts come from, the minerals in our phone come from, our food comes from. And suddenly that was laid bare for me. And it's interesting that this pandemic is now laying bare some of those very same things for everyone. But that changed my life completely, really, and changed my music, the direction it took. And that was 14 years ago. And like I said, we never stopped learning. I mean, I think that's the responsibility of having a philanthropic organization, something that it has to move resources out into the world. If you aren't able to dynamically change as the world changes, you become an institution. And we didn't want to do that. Here we are.
Yeah. Well, we decided, Peter and I, to call our hour together here with you the Phoenix process. What will emerge out of the ashes of these times? And I remember when I saw that amazing spirit performance that you did. I think it was in Philadelphia. This was, I don't know, the early 2000s. I forget.
Yeah,
but
2005. That would have been 2005. Yeah.
Yeah, and there was this huge bird in it, and this idea of this bird that decides when big change is coming to actually build a pyre of wood and incense and herbs and sit in it and burn to death so a new bird can emerge. This appears in cultures all over the world.
Right.
And so when something is so mythologically present everywhere throughout time, you're like, oh, this is a real human conundrum.
Yeah.
People have been trying to deal with this forever. How, when big change is coming, like my first reaction when big change is coming in my own life or the world is run away. I don't want to deal with it. No, even if my life isn't that great and it needs to change, like change is scary, change is hard. So right now, big changes are happening. So what do you think has to fall away, has to burn? Right. What's the burning part at the moment? And then we'll get into what could emerge.
Yeah. Well, and I think, we crave safety. We crave security. We want to be in a place of safety. And we will do, unfortunately, a lot of things to gain that at the expense of our soul in a lot of ways. And I think what I spoke to originally is what needs to burn away. And that would be, you could name it a lot of different things. I said colonizing consciousness. Some people, it's much more front and center now to talk about white supremacy or patriarchy. The key is, there's a phrase I like, everyone's guilty and no one's to blame. This has been unfolding over more than 500 years, but you could name it as 500 years in this country, and it's been spreading. And it is I think it's the base of our brain sort of still in control when, we've only been on the planet for 200,000 years. That's not very long. And so we're in a blip of time where, we're still running under this greed and scarcity and enclosure. These frameworks, that's what needs to burn away. And that could take 500 years. I mean, the time scale is a big thing for me because people want to see something in the next election cycle, or they complain about previous generations, and we're talking about hundreds of years of something that grew into this, thousands really, depending on how you mark it. It will take time to get out, but there is a death process that is necessary. And that is the most fearful time before you can start to see some ember, something that might be growing out of the ashes. Right now, the ashes are just, I think, on the edge of burning, really.
That's so beautifully said, Peter. I know. I'm so glad we're taping this because you need to remember what you said. It was great. So many questions are coming in. It's crazy. Usually at the end, there are a few, but this is wild. They're falling into two categories. One sort of the big, what's going on, the way you just said, taking a 500-year view. And some, like this one, which I love so much, Bonnie just wrote, how do I get rid of the lump in my throat that I wake up with every day? Right?
Right. Yeah.
Now, that's a hard one, but I thought we'd start hard.
Yes, and I appreciate that. Because I think a lot of people are waking up with some version of that, right? It's fearful. Yeah. It's unknown. It speaks to safety and our need for it. And we are in a place of massive unknowns, which creates a lot of anxiety, which is what creates the lump in the throat, I would imagine.
Yes.
And it's so all of this, if we're going to get through this, and I know we will, but again, it could take some time, and there will be, I think, a difficult process because of the need for, culture is tricky that way. Culture wants you to believe there's no other way. That is the first the approach to a strong culture is, or it can be, in this case, it certainly is, that this is the only way it can be. And we've been lulled into this through convenience, I think. The fact that over the last 150 years, things have gotten easier for so many of us in so many ways. Even the hardest lives are generally easier than they would have been 200 years ago. But they're not as real as they were 200 years ago. We're sort of disconnected from nearly everything. And obviously the food we eat is an example, but there's a ton of them that we've been lifted off reality. We are, as my friend Wes Jackson says, we are a species out of context. We're a species out of context. This is not who we actually are, this culture that we're in right now, through all the convenience and all of the technology and I'm not saying we should go back. I love refrigeration and indoor plumbing and all those things. I don't think we should just go back, but it's a very important thing, because the lump in your throat, our throats, our collective throats, is what's going to happen. We're going to lose these things that we've become so accustomed to and make us feel safe. And yet I do believe underneath that, once we start mostly being forced to look, I think, frankly, is that there is a layer of life that we've been disconnected from that we need to find again. And that takes a lot of different forms. It's kids have been, forced, and parents have been forced into an unusual, not unrealistic, because again, for hundreds and thousands of years, we've had tribes and we've had multiple people raising kids, and we had aunts and uncles nearby, and all these things were natural. But now we're all in our little homes, separated, and we can FaceTime somebody or we can see them on the weekend, but it's a very different existence. And so again, I go back to that lump almost being the manifestation of this disconnection and the fear.
I really like that. I like that, to reframe it, that your lump, all of our lumps, or whatever it is we feel. I wake up more with my heart kind of pounding. We could take it as a message of you're on the right track. You are grieving.
Yeah.
And you are feeling, and you are being called, and we don't quite know to what, but know that there are other people with lumps in their throat all over the world, and feel a sense of connection through it. Mm-hmm. So let me go on to another question. Chris is asking it, and I was going to ask it too. He said, well, what has been your deepest learning on how to use your wealth in a decolonized way? And I was going to ask you, what projects are you working on now that are most exciting to you about what could rise from the ashes of our disconnection?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we have always focused, the foundation was very, very much smaller before 2006, always focused on local action, knowing the people, being in relationship to the people that we're working with, and hoping to resource in some meaningful way. Indigenous people and indigenous ways of knowing that can live in frankly, all of us in ways. We can find many of those things in ourselves, but indigenous people hold that memory. And so now, over all these years, really recognizing that the only real thing is the relationships we have in the community we're a part of. Everything else starts to get disconnected. I used to talk about how when 2008 with the financial crash, if you saw your mortgage holder in the grocery store and your kids played together, it would be a different scene in 2008 because there'd be relationships there. Same with credit card debt and all these things. It used to be all relational. And so the exciting things we're doing is trying to find the seeds of those things in communities all over the country and sometimes the world, and really resourcing that and trying to nurture any place that community is really happening in terms of not just because there's a strong urge right now, and it's very understandable, to fight for things within this system. And I frankly think, although that's not misguided, it's certainly important to do for all sorts of reasons, but this system loves a fight. And from my indigenous knowledge of people and history, a right given can be a right taken away. And so what we're looking for is a resilient, connected community that can live beyond rules and regulations that happen to be in this moment. So that's urban farming connected with different ways of housing and alternative currencies, different ways of sharing and exchange. Any way we can find that something's happening on a relational level first, and it's a lot of different things.
So Darcy is asking us, do you think our democracy is actually burning? Are we in trouble here as a country? Are we going to lose what holds us together? And what can we do to be part of that not happening?
Well, this is one of my favorite subjects, so reel me in. But I don't believe we've ever had democracy. This country was built by wealthy white men, and the rules were made for them. I mean, you can't have a declaration, an aspirational document that says all men are created equal, and a legal document in the Constitution that says they're not, that blacks are 3/5, indigenous people aren't even people. This sets up
women can't vote.
Women can't vote. Women weren't even, in there anywhere. I mean, so I don't believe you can build something on that cracked of a foundational piece. Now, people will get upset that I'm anti-American or something maybe, but what are we holding on to? America is a story that has been told in a particular way, and it's not accurate. It's just not accurate. I mean, what we really are, if you pull back, is we are a very successful colony. That's what we are. We're a successful colony. And I believe it's why America has to be so big and boisterous and have the biggest army and the biggest this and the best that, because we're kind of like the bully on the playground. We have to prove something because we're actually not legitimately that inside. And so I question trying to hang on to something that isn't at its core really what it says it is. And I could go on about this, but that's
so in other words, not to feel terror and kind of romanticized grief as things fall apart, because actually they're just exposing what has never been true. And that doesn't mean it's over and America's over. It means we have a template now that we have an opportunity to create a new template and to use the time well without fear.
Yeah, and if you study Reconstruction, that right after the Civil War, that almost happened. For a couple of years there, a lot of people were saying, this is our chance. This is our chance to reconcile what we said we are with what we've been. And let's do it again. And some phenomenal things were starting to happen. And of course, they were crushed over a couple of years and things changed. And here we are because of it. But we had this opportunity before, and now we've got it again.
So I'm going to switch gears here to another subject matter of yours. Jane is asking, you're both a social visionary and a musician. So how would you suggest any teachers in the group of kids or of adults or anyone use music to counter the isolation that we're all feeling?
Well, I would say it's a critical piece of it. I mean, music, for sure. Even I was surprised when I do my shows how effective the music would sort of bridge understanding and kind of open the audience into different kinds of questions and thoughts. And music was here before language. I mean, so and language is a problem, frankly. It's only been around for about 5,000 years. And it has codified things that until then were kind of open and freer to interpretation. And, in a native community, you'd sing in the morning, you'd sing in the hunt, you'd say, whatever it would be. There's a lot more singing and dancing than there was talking in general. And so music is a critical piece for sure. Now, in terms of, I don't know, the specificity around teachers or something like that, but in terms of teaching music and allowing music to flow, from children in particular, it's a critical time for that, for sure.
Well, I'm thinking of how you have funded, and Jennifer especially, her interest in funding groups that are bringing mindfulness and emotional social learning into classrooms,
Right.
dealing with the loss of any of that kind of teaching in classrooms.
Right.
What tell us about that work that you have funded?
Yeah, and it's so interesting. You know, it's considered. It has the umbrella name of SEL, social emotional learning, and it's a variety of approaches. We've worked with multiple districts around the country because we feel it is district wide. It needs to be implemented in a way that really covers everybody from the bus driver and who's doing the cleaning to the principal and beyond. And yet it's still a patch in a way. Our education system was developed in the late 19th century for assimilation. That's what it was for. It was meant to bring immigrant kids into the system, teach them how it's done here, and get them to the factory. Nothing's changed. We seem to be able to upgrade all sorts of technology and have all these breakthroughs over the last 100 years, but education is fundamentally the same. And so SEL is an attempt, and will continue to be, to bring heart and soul and connection into the lives and the stories of the kids into the classroom and into the school setting. Ultimately, though, I think how we raise our kids and bring them into the world needs to be completely scrapped and started over. And this is an exciting opportunity for that, because school may certainly not be the same for the next school year, and it may never be the same. And this is an opportunity for a great reimagining of what school can be.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, there's a line in your book that I love. It's a whole chapter about talking to younger people and begging them not to do what you say, rushing your destiny. Don't rush your destiny. This idea that at age 18, when you choose a college, and then 22 when you leave, that you have to know exactly who you're going to be and you're going to do it. Now, this has been exploded for young people right now. They're home. They may not go back to school for a while. There's no jobs. They can't, quote unquote, rush their destiny. Maybe you could spin a more hooray, positive light on that.
Yeah, I will definitely say hooray to that. I mean, again, the pandemic has just opened this wide hole in just about everything we thought we knew. And that's exciting. That is the phoenix beginning to burn, which is the scary part. But what can rise from this is, there's a great saying, if you don't use your imagination, someone else will. And that's been happening for decades and decades, and more so every time, every screen, every app, every somebody else is using our imagination. And this is the opening where kids who knew who they were at 18? Not me, 22, not me. I mean, I was still trying to figure it out, and I was fortunate in some of my directions, but to open that up now for an 18-year-old, a 19-year-old, whatever age that might be for all of us on some level, is the opportunity of a lifetime to think, who am I really? And that's also the quest of a lifetime, is who am I? And, I could go on about this, but we're born into other people's stories. We did not ask to be born to our parents, as far as I know. So we are born into other people's stories, and we develop slower than any other species on Earth, way slower. A horse, I think, can walk in 20 minutes or something. I mean, every other species figures out who it is and what it's supposed to do very quickly. We don't really become autonomous until around 12 or 13, if we had to be. And that's 12 or 13 years of somebody else telling us who we should be, what we should look like, what's cool, what's not, what's important, what isn't. So we are impressed upon by a culture that wants us to behave a certain way in order to fit into it. And now that culture is blown open, and all of us, but certainly kids coming into themselves in that age group, have a chance to think, who am I really, if I stripped away all of the external influences. In audio, we have a phrase called signal to noise, and you want a strong signal and you want low noise. And all the incoming stuff is noise. And we have no shortage of noise. And the signal, of course, is here. It's in us. It's in our heart and soul. And to strip all the noise away and find out who we are, which is not going to happen overnight. It's certainly a quest. But now's the time when school's not going to tell us.
Yeah, well, Perry is asking, so many people have lost their jobs, maybe permanently. And so it's a very squishy time, a lot of fearful, what am I actually going to do? Not even time to think, who am I going to be?
Right.
And at the same time, a real desire to be part of what you're saying. So he asked, what can be done to shift millions of humans to do work that's more compassionate and caring and collaborative? Now, of course, you do not have the answer, Peter Buffett, right now, especially since you told us it could take 500 years.
Right.
But if you could, let's say you could just magically switch a switch on, and everybody wouldn't be struggling so much right now, and we could all be doing different things. What do you see? What in your dream of dreams do you see?
Oh boy, it's it's hard because I do think of these timescales, and I also know that we're living in this time of overwhelm in terms of information and recognizing there's millions upon millions of people, and it suddenly becomes, that also creates a lump in your throat because it's overwhelming. It's too many, and yet it really gets down to taking the first step. And each one of us to take the first step. And to me, that means walking out the door and getting to know your neighbor and hearing stories you might not otherwise hear, and finding an empathy or connection, or that's what I find. It always happens when we had a hurricane here a number of years ago, and I met all my neighbors, and I wouldn't have known them otherwise. And so these disasters, in a sense, give us a chance to meet our neighbors, to meet ourselves, to see ourselves in our neighbors. And that starts, what I'm starting to see is more mutual aid networks coming online. And that's the beginning of it, realizing that we're in this together. We need to care about each other and find commonalities that we otherwise would have never known existed. And of course, with COVID, it's difficult because we're supposed to be 6 feet away from our neighbor. But if I could give that one, it would be to kind of lift the veil of all the false disconnections that have been happening. One thing I would wave is that all broadcast mediums shut down forever. That would be one thing I wish could happen, so that we weren't, there's a reason they call it programming on television. It's programming. If we can remove the programming from the outside world and start to, again, connect on an individual level with ourselves, with our partners, with our neighbors, with our community, that's how millions and millions will actually be affected. It'll be one by one.
That's beautiful. As you were talking, I have this sticky on my computer. I'm always putting quotes, and I've been living by this one for the past few weeks. It's from Don Miguel Ruiz, the Mexican shaman teacher who wrote The Four Agreements, and he's been a very, very beloved teacher at Omega over the years. And it's this line, be skeptical of your negativity. And I can be so negative in these times because I do get programmed by what I see on the nightly news and Twitter and all the things that are polluting my brain and heart. And I tend to see that I believe the negativity more than the positivity. That's such a weird human thing. Yeah. Something negative comes in. Oh, yeah, that's real. Something positive. Oh, that's sweet.
Right.
Yeah. So something I love about you is you are positive. You are a positive person, but you're also very practical.
Right.
It's a strange combination of of sincere positivity, like sort of active positivity,
Yeah.
and you're a very rational, effective leader as well. How do you walk? What do you have a practice, like a spiritual practice, or any? What do you do? How do you do that?
Well, I mean, I would say partly, well, thank you, first of all. And that it's been about 10 years, I guess, that Jennifer and I moved upstate and are in nature and more connected. I'm barefoot all the time. So there's a part of it truly that you can't necessarily quantify, but it's hugely qualitative. And that is being connected to nature and recognizing, of course, we're a part of nature. And that gets back to time scales. It starts to change. And I love history, and I've read a lot about various things and how we got here, because that to me is part of my work too as a philanthropist, is to understand the complexities of what got us here. And that helps, because I do feel like I'm just here in a moment in time that we can do what we can, but if we can just knock the little thing a little ways, it can 500 years from now end up way over here in a positive way. And so I'm very excited about what we can become, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. And so that's the pragmatism and sort of the rational, like, what are we going to do today to help get there? But we probably won't see it in our lifetime. And so I'm just excited that I have the opportunity to do it at all. And
That's so great. It reminds me of my mother was an English teacher, and she made her daughters, 4 daughters, she made us memorize poems and lines from great literature, and we hated it. But I have these lines in my head all the time, and they make me remember her and the wisdom of the ages. And you were just reminding me of the opening to Charles Dickens'
right,
great A Tale of Two Cities.
Right.
Yeah. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And it goes on to say, it was the time of light, it was the time of darkness. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. Mm-hmm. And that was written in the 1800s about the French Revolution. And I always, when people say things like, this is the end of times, this is the worst time, this is the end of times, I'm like, wow, read your history, man. Right. This is a difficult time, and climate change is certainly making it a certain sense of doom to it, but it's not the end of times, and it's not the worst of times. And that is a spiritual practice of sorts. It's sort of getting the little ego out of the way. Right. We're not the only people who've ever lived here who will live here.
Yeah.
We're not the only species that matters. Yeah. You're not the only person going through hard times. Like, we are a continuum of life, expanding and growing. Right. And like I said, be skeptical of the negative and water the seeds of the positive.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, there's a great native saying that says, they tried to bury us, they didn't realize we were seeds, right? And I think we're seeing some of that as well. We're seeing people that have been oppressed, and yet to them, it's just to them, it's a lot of things. I'm not going to put that on how I can define it, but there is a sense of circularity to life, that things do come around. And yes, there's a linear aspect to life, but honestly, it's circular, and we are experiencing something that our ancestors experienced. And we're going to get it maybe a little more right this time, but we're still going to have to go through it again. And, 250 years, 500 years from now, they'll look back on this time. And, I'm hoping it's not called the Second Civil War, but it's called the Great Awakening, but we'll see what happens. And yet we are going through it. The only way out is through, as my wife, Jennifer, often says. And it's absolutely true. And it will be, difficult. I mean, it already is difficult for so many, but it was difficult 100 years ago for, certain populations, while others, skirted through. So it's just a different time, but it's not the end times for sure.
Yeah. Stephen is saying, what about people and institutions that don't want this change? And other people lined up here in these questions have been asking, like, there's such a division. How do we talk to people who actually are not excited about these times for a whole variety of reasons, want things to stay the same, or are approaching it with great anger and fear and attack? Like, how do we talk to people who and institutions that aren't with us?
Yeah, which, that is our constant struggle in terms of how much time do you spend trying to either
Right.
convince or bring along or whatever it might be, and how much time do you just say, you know what, we got to go there, wherever it is. And of course, a lot of people are saying the same thing and they want to go a different direction. So we are in a phenomenally splintered time. Of course, we all know that. And it's interesting with identity politics mixed in, and the need for identity. I mean, I'm not dismissing that. I'm saying that it makes it more complicated. We are in a time, I would say, like the printing press, in terms of how it is going to change our consciousness. The printing press, like language before it, changed how we thought about ourselves and our place in the world and what we could write down to pass on and all these things. That changed our consciousness tremendously. And the internet is doing the same thing. And the internet is part of why the pandemic is having the effect it's had, because we can do this. We can actually be online and talk to each other. The pandemic hit 25 years ago, we wouldn't be able to do this, and it would be a very different story. So all the divisions are, in a sense, part of the stew of our species right now. And it's good. It's creating problems, and it's going to create more problems. I think that this is an opportunity for a true consciousness shift, which we've never really had. I think maybe agriculture, maybe language, and like I said, the printing. There's certain markers that have shifted. There's a wonderful book about this, really shifted our consciousness. But this is one that could take us to another level, and that will take probably hundreds of years, but we're at the beginning of it. I mean, what a fun time to have been born, where we can maybe help bridge, because that's really what we're talking about here, is how do we bridge between the safety and security that people want to have and will do almost anything for it. I mean, that's where Naomi Klein's shock doctrine comes in, where, people take a catastrophe and rush in there and push their agenda because they know people would rather have safety than a catastrophe. And so there will be people, as there are already, trying to make reality into their form while it's all gooey and they can't, nobody knows. But it's every one of our jobs to build a bridge when you think you can build it, and walk away from it when you think you can't, and keep moving with your heart open and connected. And we won't all be going the same direction for a very, very long time, I think. But there's enough of us out there. Timothy Leary said, "Find the others," and that is part of what we need to do right now, is find the others, find the consciousness that relates.
A lot of people have been asking about the rise in consciousness around race right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I know I've been having trouble when people ask me about it, because I have felt it's a time more for me as a white woman to listen, right, and to learn and to grow and to pass the mic to other people. But there are so many questions to you about the relationship now to COVID actually creating a space in the culture where people are finally listening, I hope, and there'll be some traction around the race inequity question. So do you have anything to add to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's so challenging to me, because historically, this country does not have anything close to a good record. And while laws can be passed, it doesn't change the consciousness necessarily of the people. And I would say most times it doesn't. I mean, you can have compliance, but that doesn't mean you've changed your mind about something. And so therein lies the rub again of trying to very importantly expose the structures and systems that have been here for hundreds and hundreds of years, and that they have led to deep inequalities and systemic racism and all the things that are absolutely true and should be lifted up. And for those people that don't understand how deep it runs and how wide it runs. And yet we need, I think, eventually we're going to get to a place where it's about the consciousness, because we've got, because divide and conquer is the oldest trick in the book ultimately. And right now we're creating more divisions while at the same time raising some consciousness, right? So it's not one or the other, it's not either or, but don't forget that divide and conquer is the oldest trick in the book. So if we are obsessed with race moving forward, it's important to acknowledge and correct and shift all these things in time for sure. But at some point, if we live inside a divisive culture, whether it's race, gender, whatever it might be, there's the opportunity to divide. And we have to figure out how to get past that so that we can be truly a connected neighborhood, community, world, whatever it might be.
Yeah. I call that, there's activism, so important, and then there's innervism. I call it innervism because if you call it like contemplation or meditation, it sounds like, om, and you're just zooming out. But innervism to me is actively working on myself, my ego, my desire to be right, my defensiveness, my anger that is not good, healthy anger. It's just me like blathering my own discomfort all over people. Mm-hmm. So I take my spiritual practice so seriously. I call it innervism so that I can know that it is part of my activism. If I'm only active, as you say, it turns into a fight. And the desire, the oppressor wants a fight. Mm-hmm. But if I just focus on peace of mind and disconnect and put my head in the sand and pretend the world is all right for everybody, that's not good either. So I'm always walking this line between my very serious spiritual work on myself, shadow work, how am I projecting my own discomfort onto other people, and how am I abusing power myself and not doing power differently in a new way, really observing myself, and then sometimes being like, forget it, I'm an imperfect person, I'll never be perfect, I'm going out and making some change in this world. So I try to balance both of them.
Yeah, and it's such a challenge. I mean, because we fund so many organizations that are doing incredible work, but we found that a lot of activists are trying to fix out there, but they haven't addressed inside. And that's where you get burnout, because you're essentially burning all of these things that really are happening for you internally, and you're trying to fix it out there. And it's a continual challenge, but everything starts with you, with me, with each of us.
Mm-hmm. Fiona wrote in and said, before COVID, I was in a low place, depressed, and both pandemics have helped me feel super connected. How do I spread this positivity in the midst of these times?
Boy, how do you spread it? Because if you can't go out and connect with other people in the way you might, which would of course spread it, and that's really what I'm talking about. Is if you feel it here, it will ripple out. I mean, I've got this great relationship with my nephew, and because of that, my sister and I are in a better relationship. I mean, all these things just start to happen in a beautiful way. But the pandemic, it's a damper on taking what you're feeling inside and moving it out. So I don't have a great answer for that. You might, but that's complicated.
Well, I go back to what you said, taking the long view, not necessarily 500 years, maybe 5 months,
Yes.
maybe a year. Like, this is not going away fast. I wake up every day with that lump in my throat, but that lump is an impatience,
Right.
kind of an annoyance. Like, what? I still can't go to California and see my brand new grandson that I haven't seen? What? And when I think what's being called for now is a sense of active patience. Like, I am using patience right now, and I'm going to develop myself and the relationships right around me, just the way you said that you gave your nephew so much love and it changed your relationship with your sister. Well, I think most of us have some connection with somebody, whether it's just my husband who I see, and let me tell you, I can improve the way I am there. If I just devoted myself to being the kindest, most open and attentive wife I could be, I swear to God, that could change the world as much as going out now and spreading positivity far and wide. So I am every day returning to, this is the reality now. Use it well. It won't be here forever. Use it now. Come back within into the smallest circle and the biggest changes I can make in the smallest circle.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's a practice that then you can carry on for the rest of your life. But this is a perfect time to work on that and really, yeah. I mean, there's nothing more any of us can do really than start here and really examine what's motivating us to take the actions we're taking.
And then, Will from Facebook asked this, and other people I haven't gotten to their questions have asked a similar thing, like, okay, when we can start going out again, taking into account what you said, that you want to work with the communities where you live. Not that that's the only work you do, but a big focus is on the small city where you are closest to, and then the farms and the working people in the whole area. Like, when we can go out, do you have any, and we'll be winding down in a few minutes. We're getting to the end of the hour, but what's been exciting for you in non-COVID times about working with the local community, the farm hub, your work in Kingston, New York? Like, talk about that.
The fun for me is because I love music and I love production and I do a lot of that. I'm sitting here in my studio right now. I love bringing parts together and creating some harmonious whole. and so for me, the farm and the radio station and all the interconnecting elements then within Kingston where I live have taught me so much about the complex ecosystem that we've built that, again, feels sort of insurmountable. And luckily, we have resources where we can start to sort of fill in places where otherwise people would be having to go raise money for this, or, oh, we couldn't do this because it says that we need this many people in order to make it viable financially. We can start to kind of open that up a little bit and have people, it gets back to the imagination, really think creatively. And then once they do, they start to see each other not as competing organizations, but complementary. And how can we work together and change how education works, change how the food system works, change how production and consumption in a community works? We can start to really allow for that in terms of the imagination and the willingness to work together, because they're not battling over resources necessarily. And so that's been very fun, because then I can get in and understand how the relationships, which matter most of all, are kind of built and constricted by certain frameworks that we all grew up in different ways. And so it's just this revealing really of what makes community, how complicated it is to overcome the systems that have taken over so much of our lives, but that what the possibilities allow for when they do. It's very exciting.
Yeah, our CEO, Skip Backus, has, we've been having these in-depth conversations about how will we reimagine ourselves at Omega in a post-COVID world. And he's been saying his desire for us to be a hub for the imagination.
Yeah.
And I love that idea that, like, we imagined the world we live in now, and then some people made it happen. So we can imagine another way, and then try as hard as we can with whatever resources we have. Most of us don't have the resources you have, but we have resources. We have our energy, we have our time, we have our brilliance and our desires. But it does come from this confidence in our imagination. Like, hey, somebody else made it up.
Right.
This is all just made up.
Right. Yeah.
Let's make something else up.
It's all been made up. Thomas Jefferson was 33 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, and he did it in 3 weeks with a little bit of help. But the point is, it's not, this is actually not rocket science. This is something we can try something else, and maybe it's going to be better.
Yeah. All right. So I just want to say that as we close out in a few minutes now, we're going to close out to one of your beautiful new songs called The Field. And not you singing it right now, but a recording of it. And one of the lyrics in it that I keep repeating to myself, but I don't even really know exactly what you meant by them, but I love them. You say, now that time has broken, all the seeds are safe to open.
Yeah.
Now that time has broken, all the seeds are safe to open. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, so this is a few weeks or so after COVID hit and everything stopped, and it really felt like time had broken. Again, I love history. In 1345, the hour was split into 60 minutes and the minute was split into 60 seconds. And that was less than 700 years ago. That's not very long, again, with timescales being more realistically looked at. And our brains are completely wired by this framing that is completely made up. It's not real. And so time felt like it had broken. Like suddenly I couldn't remember what day it was. And, everything was fluid. The kids were home all the time. All these different things were happening. And so I thought, what a time when there's suddenly no time, in a sense, when it's all opened up and the sun comes up and the sun goes down, and it's the seeds really of imagination and specifically childlike imagination. I think of seeds, of course, as the beginning of anything. And so these new beginnings, this new imagination, the new possibilities were safe to come out because there was no constraint from our usual grid, time, mechanized, we have to do this now, we have to do this now. And it just felt like a fluid opening that was going to allow for lots of possibility.
Oh, so beautiful. What a perfect place to end our fantastic conversation. Thank you, everyone, for being part of it. Thank you for calling in all your questions. And it really did feel like a community. And I just want to thank you. And want to say, stay in touch with us through our website. We also have a private Facebook group called the Omega Online Community that you can join. And if you check in with us through Facebook or through our website, you'll find out about other Zoom, Facebook conversations like this one that we will continue to have. And you also might want to think about supporting Omega as we struggle toward survival and thrival, and look toward becoming a hub of imagination into the future. And we love everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. We're going to sign out now. Thank you, Peter, for being with us. Really beautiful talk.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Okay, let's listen to Peter's beautiful song, The Field, and we'll see y'all later.